And now I will call to the stage Sue Sisley. If we're talking about researchers who are fighting the good fight, if we're talking about researchers who are working in spite of the system and fighting the system, Sue is a shining light. She has done more work in PTSD than possibly anyone else and is pushing forward the PTSD agenda in the US. She's currently the principal investigator in the only FDA-approved study looking at whole plant cannabis for the treatment of PTSD. Sue, I call you to the stage and I thank you for everything you've done.
Well, I am thrilled to be here. I am so honored. I think they're going to try to turn down the lights a little. That's great. So that way you guys can see slides a little bit easier. So I'm just going to talk quickly just about my background so you guys know how I ended up in this space. So you guys know I'm from Arizona. I've lived in Scottsdale for about 30 years, and I practice internal medicine and psychiatry. So basically, I do primary care medicine, and I've treated military veterans for about 20 years now. I started at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Phoenix, and I was on faculty at the University of Arizona College of Medicine for about 8 years, until I became the principal investigator on this marijuana study, which suddenly put me at odds with an administration that did not value this work, that did not want the optics of having marijuana studied on a public, public school campus, and eventually we were terminated despite having institutional review board approval. And but the great news was that within about a week we had 300 media outlets covering this termination, which was a real big value for us because we had been working for years to try to shine a spotlight on the barriers to research, and suddenly the media became a big ally in teaching people about what had happened. And just so you guys know, I've never actually tried cannabis in any formulation. I do that on purpose. I'd like to enter the research without any preconceived notions about how cannabis works. So that's a choice I make. But I also, I don't write recommendations for marijuana for patients. I don't participate in the industry. I don't own dispensaries or grows. I just care about the science and doing good research. This was the very subversive work we were trying to do here. You can see we were trying to do a study looking at whole plant marijuana in veterans with PTSD. It's very straightforward. But the great thing that happened after being terminated was we got a wonderful partnership with Johns Hopkins University, with UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, with UC Denver, University of Colorado, and many of you know my sponsor, MAPS. They've been incredible. The way they've stood by us through this whole process, and so the great thing that happened was after being tossed out of the university, we were suddenly awarded our first government grant ever. We got a $2.1 million grant from the Colorado Health Department to conduct our study, and the Colorado Health Department also allocated about $9 million to study all kinds of different areas of efficacy research, right? So this is very rare in the US that you ever find government money available to study the efficacy of marijuana. Most of the money available in the US is to do safety studies on marijuana, meaning looking at harmful side effects of marijuana and addiction potential of marijuana. But suddenly you see here that we're going to be able to look at all of these different areas. They took $9 million and gave it to 9 projects. Ours was the largest of the group, but within 3 years, we should have published data in all of these areas, which will be really valuable. Yeah. So that was great. So our study is actually the first and only randomized controlled trial in the world looking at whole plant marijuana for PTSD. That's why we're fighting so hard to get this going. And you'll see here, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the saga that marijuana's been through in the US. This has been a crazy situation where, at first it started as medicine. In the 1800s, you can see there, we have the U.S. Pharmacopoeia is basically our nation's formulary. It's how we decided what meds, are work for what illnesses. And even back in 1850, you see that marijuana was already identified to be useful for these various ailments. But particularly interesting is that they already noticed that it was useful for opioid addiction and pain pill dependency, that it was already deemed to be helpful for alcoholics who are trying to wean themselves off alcohol. So these are all things that we're hoping to study more now that, but already, centuries ago, they already identified this. And then many people talked yesterday about, we got our first drug czar in 1937. Harry Anslinger is became very famous because he commissioned the movie Reefer Madness that, has been so damaging to our drug policy. And you can see here, he created a lot of hysteria around the world. That's why marijuana is so politically radioactive, is partly because of this film, which really created had a big effect on our mindset. He claimed that marijuana caused violence. He claimed that, marijuana, he made all kinds of racist statements about marijuana and the use among minorities. And then finally, decades later, in 1970, Richard Nixon adopted the Controlled Substances Act. And we all know what happened then. Suddenly, marijuana was thrown into the category of Schedule I, which means among the most dangerous drugs. And the problem that we have with this scheduling is that it's done by DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, or law enforcement professionals who are deciding on the medical benefits of these various drugs. And it doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at the list carefully. I think we all agree it's absurd that cannabis is lumped into Schedule I with all these much more toxic psychedelics and other drugs. But what's even worse, if you look at Schedule IV, which the DEA defines as drugs having little addiction potential, and yet you see drugs like, benzodiazepines are like Ativan, Xanax, Klonopin, all these drugs that we know have huge street value, highly addictive. So I think all of us would argue that this entire schedule needs to be reorganized by medical people who understand the properties of these drugs. And, when Dr. Gupta, we were so lucky that he came out publicly with his statement where he talked about, he said, I mistakenly believed the DEA when they said that cannabis has, no medical benefit, that it belonged in the category of the most dangerous drugs. And then he went on to say that, they didn't have the science to defend that position. They never have. And the truth is that we have been terribly and systematically misled in the U.S. by for 70 years by this propaganda. So this was incredibly powerful. We all know that this was a big game changer for the marijuana movement when he came out. And he continues, he's a very credible physician. Gupta continues to do neurosurgery procedures every week at Emory University. So he's very much still embedded in patient care, but he developed a real interest in this because he saw the injustice of all this. So I started caring about marijuana for PTSD because of all these veterans I was taking care of in my practice. The military veterans were claiming that they were getting benefit from this plant in all of these symptoms that you see here. And when they first started disclosing this to me about 10 years ago, I became, I was very skeptical. I was, so I'm trained in a very conservative medical model where we don't value any meds unless they've been put through the FDA process. So I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that a plant could treat all of these symptoms. But eventually they just kept teaching me, and eventually I started to see that this argument had real merit, and I began, hearing the collateral history from all of their family members helped me understand that there has, even if these are just subjective reports, that we owe it to the veterans of our country to at least study this plant in a rigorous and controlled environment rather than just dismissing their claims as, oh, these are just, drug-seeking behavior. What happened then, I became acutely aware of the suicide epidemic among our military veterans. And I have lost many military veterans in my own medical practice to suicide. But then suddenly the data came out last year, you guys may remember from the VA, where they reported that 22 veterans each day killed themselves in the U.S. And I know from my own practice that has to be a falsely low estimate, because the truth is that all of the veterans who have killed themselves in my practice have all been labeled accidents. And yet I know that these patients were actively suicidal. When I recently had a veteran who drove his motorcycle into a barricade at 100 miles an hour, and he had left a suicide note at home, and he was known to be suicidal for many years, and yet it was labeled an accident. So you can see how, it's very rare that a coroner's office will go the distance and do the kind of research required to label something a suicide. But you can see, it's already a horrific number, right? 22 a day is sickening and really should be viewed as a serious public health crisis. And yet our government continues to impede research like this that could answer questions about marijuana as a treatment for this. So this was, when we talk about the epidemic of prescription drug overdose, it's stunning. We've become the capital of prescription drug overdose on the planet. And I think that one of the reasons I became concerned about this was I realized that we only have 2 medications on the market in the U.S. to treat PTSD. All we have is Zoloft and Paxil. And for any of you who've been on those meds, or family members who've been on them, you'll know that they're very disappointing. They have tons of side effects. They cause weight gain and sexual dysfunction. So here these veterans come home from service. They just want to reintegrate into their family, and we make them fat and impotent and useless. And what is more shocking is that all of the medicines that I'm allowed to prescribe, when those medicines don't work. So you'll see here, the media keeps talking about the fact that these meds that we're using are really no better than placebo. And that's true. You see here, when these meds don't work, I'm allowed to use all of these medications here. Look at all these classes of medications that are fair game here. All of the antidepressants from any class. The list goes on and on. This is just a partial list. But all of these are acceptable in my practice, and nobody would fault me for writing any of these prescriptions to these patients. All of the bipolar meds, the mood stabilizers, the anticonvulsants, the sleep meds, the antipsychotics. So you can see what happens. These folks, they get put on, in psychiatry, we haven't come very far, where every target symptom gets a different prescription. So slowly these patients end up snowballing on 10, 12, 15 different prescriptions over the course of a year, and they feel like guinea pigs, They just feel like they're, we're just pummeling them with all these different meds that aren't really doing anything. And in the end, what happens is we see veterans have a 33% higher rate of prescription drug overdose. That doesn't surprise me at all, because we in the medical profession are the ones who give them this weapon to use against themselves. When these medicines don't work, they end up stockpiling them at home. And of course, during a moment of darkness, a loneliness in home, they end up taking all of these meds and ending their life. So this is a really huge tragedy. And suddenly this article came out last year in JAMA. Many of you guys remember this because it was so amazing to see that in the 23 medical cannabis states that we were able to document a 25% reduction in opioid overdose deaths. And what was more intriguing about the data, if you look deeper into the data of the article, you see that each year that these 23 states had a medical marijuana law, that the data would become stronger, that the opioid deaths would continue to diminish each year the program existed. So very compelling correlation between legalizing medical cannabis and patients possibly using cannabis as substitution therapy. This illustration was done by one of our veterans, and it's an incredibly accurate portrayal of what these veterans are dealing with. They're drowning in pills and pill bottles, and they suddenly discover, in this case, a joint, and find that it's life-saving. And that's what I think deserves research, is the fact that our veterans are claiming that this plant has saved their life, and we owe it to these vets to look at this more deeply. So this is a presentation that I recently gave at Walter Reed Hospital. Many of you guys know Walter Reed is, the preeminent military hospital in the U.S. The fact that we were invited there to present 2.5 hours of marijuana content to these military doctors is symbolic of the ways that we're starting to break through, and doctors are becoming interested in this. And when people tell you all the time that there's no data to support cannabis as medicine, or there's not enough research, I want you to just take this example of, we're going to look at PTSD only here, and I'm just going to show you all the articles that I've compiled from peer-reviewed medical journals, and I'm not going to go through all these with you because we're short on time, but I just want you to see the immense amount of literature that's been published on this. Even back in 2002, you can see Nature documenting cannabinoids as useful in suppressing fear activation in the amygdala. But this is one article that I really wanted to point out here. This Dr. Greer, a psychiatrist out of New Mexico, he followed 80 veterans through the New Mexico medical marijuana program, and he was able to document a 75% reduction in PTSD symptoms. If I could achieve that with the conventional medicines that I give to people every day, that would be a triumph. But I can't. The standard meds don't make that, they don't achieve that kind of efficacy. So this was incredibly compelling. This data, it was a peer-reviewed journal that just came out a year ago, and it really was so persuasive that it caused our state health department director in Arizona to add PTSD as a qualifying condition based on that. So even though it's an observational study, it did go through peer review. He does use the CAP scale there. This is, I just wanted to show you that this is an incredible list of, look at all these references of articles, all, gone through peer review, talking about marijuana for PTSD. So when they tell you there's no literature, they just need to do a simple search, and they will uncover all of these. And one of the challenges that we are facing in this movement is that the endocannabinoid system is still not taught in mainstream medical school curriculum. There was just recently a survey. Yeah, exactly. You guys may have seen, there was a survey published where they interviewed 250 medical schools in the U.S. and documented, thank you, they documented that only under 10 schools even mentioned the endocannabinoid system in any of the mainstream medical school curriculum. So you can see that this is what we're up against. Doctors are not even exposed to this material in their training, and so how can we expect them to view it as medicine? All we're taught in medical school is basically that it's dangerous and that it's highly addictive. So what I wanted to do here, because we're short on time, so I'm going to just jump to, because I wanted to point out some of the barriers to research so that you guys would see what we're dealing with here. So it's interesting that in the US, it's easier to study LSD, MDMA, anything in Schedule 1. Marijuana is the hardest, and I wanted to give you a better understanding of why this happens. And let's see here. So, and what's absurd is now we have, 35 states that have some form of medical marijuana law on the books. We always talk about the 23 states, but basically there's another 11 states that have CBD only laws. So there's 35 states that acknowledge that cannabinoids have therapeutic value. But why are they blocking this research? For me, this is classic, federal government overreach, federal government trying to micromanage research. If you want to study any controlled substance in the U.S., you have to go through these three agencies. No, not disputing that. I think that's reasonable. But what happens when you want to study marijuana, I put this side by side so you could see how ridiculous this is, that you have to go through 2 additional layers of government red tape that don't have any timeline. So they can take 10 months or 10 years to review your protocol, and that's how they stymie this work. This Public Health Service review took us 3 years to get through that process. They didn't require any protocol changes at the end of it, and during those 3 years, 24,000 veterans killed themselves in the U.S. So we ask ourselves, why do they initiate all these layers of government bureaucracy around this? The good news is that this PHS review was finally ended last year by Obama through an executive order, and this was a huge achievement for research, but it still doesn't end the biggest barrier to research in the U.S. It doesn't end what we call, we used to call the NIDA monopoly. So why is it my study is fully funded, has almost all the federal approvals, FDA, all of that, and yet it's still not underway? It's because of this, basically the DEA mandates that the NIDA, the agency NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA will have a government-enforced monopoly on the only federally legal supply of cannabis for any of these FDA-approved trials. And so what they do is, back in 1968, they gave this sole license to University of Mississippi. Here you can see Dr. El Soli. He's got his hand in a barrel of ground-up marijuana. That's what they do. They throw the entire plant into the grinder from root to tip. They roll it up into these cigarettes that are shipped out to investigators all over the country to do safety studies. And you can see here when Dr. Rousseau dumped out the contents of this, took pictures of it for us, this is what you get is stems and leaves and sticks and a lot of extraneous plant material, when what we really want to use is the flowering part of the plant, right? So this is what's so frustrating. Here in Israel, you have the opportunity to use this. And in the U.S., we're forced to use what we perceive as a very substandard study drug. So why do other countries allow multiple growers? I think because they want to ensure a good supply for research, and we don't do that in the U.S. All these countries, these are the countries I found that license multiple growers, and so we're fighting for that same thing. In the U.S., we would like to see the DEA finally license somebody else besides a university to provide study drug. For instance, if you go on the NIDA website, you see that you can only get 12% THC. That's the maximum. If I'm trying to do a real-world study, imitate what veterans are doing day to day, most veterans are accessing cannabis at 20 to 25% THC. So this is a big problem that I can't get the strains that we need to do this research. NIDA refuses to turn over their drug master file so that we can't, we don't know anything about the plant. We don't know anything except the THC to CBD ratio. We don't know what the terpene profile is. We don't know what other cannabinoids in the plant. We don't know what conditions it was grown under. The DEA claims that they have a right to be the only grower because of international treaty, but the fact is all these other countries have enabled other growers without this. So I'll leave you with this. Nora Volkow, the head of NIDA, we've developed some unlikely allies in ending the DEA monopoly. Even the head of NIDA has said that she doesn't want the monopoly, that they didn't want it. She was testified at a U.S. Senate hearing recently that basically, they asked her, are you concerned that the monopoly is blocking research? And she said yes. And they said, does the monopoly exist for any other Schedule I drug? No. So hopefully by the next time we get to talk to you guys, Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to just point out the reason that we feel this monopoly is unfair is because the Controlled Substances Act says that that the government is required to provide an adequate and uninterrupted supply of cannabis. And we would argue that, having only 12% THC, having other, strains that we've requested that were never available is not an adequate supply. It is not uninterrupted. We had to wait 20 months for marijuana that any other expert grower here in Israel could have produced in 3 months, grown to spec for us. But here, so this is an absurd situation that we have to go through a single grower. And I think, let me just see here, because I know we're short on time and I just want to wrap this up. So right now, just so you guys are aware, my sponsor, MAPS, is preparing a lawsuit against the DEA. They've already beaten the DEA once. They won many years ago. They sued the DEA and won. But unfortunately, the DEA rejected their own judge's recommendation and chose to keep their monopoly. NIDA is only allowed to provide marijuana for research purposes, but we're trying to do drug development studies. So our goal is to try to put whole plant marijuana through the entire FDA drug development process, and we're not that far away. I know people are skeptical that, that's decades away. It's not true. Our study would take 2 years, this phase 2 trial. And after that, we go to phase 3, and phase 3 would be another 3 years. And after phase 3, it's possible that this drug could be on the market, that this plant would have an FDA indication to treat PTSD. So that would be an incredible game changer in the U.S. that would enable us to persuade insurance companies to cover cannabis on formulary. So that's our hope. You can see here, this was Professor Craker. Many of you know his story at UMass. He was the one who petitioned the DEA over and over again to become he's a world-class plant biologist at the university. We sued the DEA in 2007. The judge ordered the DEA to release their monopoly and license other growers. And of course, they refused. The DEA rejected this request by the judge. We took them to the Court of Appeals and we lost. So now we're preparing a new case that you'll see. The only hope we have, the DEA is really not accountable to anybody. The only ones that they listen to, the Attorney General could order the DEA to, break this monopoly. Also the drug czar and President Obama, that's our last hope. If he could do as he did last year and ended the Public Health Service review, maybe he would be willing to, order that this DEA monopoly be ended before he leaves office. That would be a huge victory. Other unlikely allies, Grover Norquist, many of you know, one of the big conservatives, I surprisingly wrote a letter encouraging the government to end the monopoly. So that's what I mean about unlikely allies, that we have all these conservatives that recognize the injustice of blocking research, of research being shackled by politics, and the fact that this is not fair and it does not help. We have millions of patients in the U.S. and around the world who have legitimate clinical questions about how marijuana works and what strains are best for what illnesses. And with the way our government keeps impeding this work, it is unlikely we will be able to answer these questions in the U.S. So the comments yesterday about seeking research opportunities in Israel are very sensible, and I'm eager to partner with folks here and in this country and continue the work there. So thank you all very much.